Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. We are live with Sarah, and she's going to be talking about hacking VoIPs. She's one of the amazing person in cloud security. She has shared her experience, and we met a couple of times. And I know that she's going to be amazing with the session. I've heard her speaking. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I should share my screen, shouldn't I? That would be a good start. So let's get that going. Cool. As you've probably already seen today, I'm going to talk about hacking VoIP. So very quickly though, today you may notice all my PowerPoint slides come from the PowerPoint design ideas. I just thought it would be fun to use design ideas because it's a fairly new thing in PowerPoint and I just wanted to give it a go. So I'm really sorry. Oops, wrong way. Sorry if this hurts your eyes. I did just let PowerPoint decide how to design my slides. I thought it would be fun. I'm not the best designer myself, so it's probably better than anything I could do. And if you haven't ever used the PowerPoint design ideas, I'd have a play around with it. It's pretty cool. So who am I? Really quick, I'm an Azure security architect. I am based in Melbourne in Australia. I'm currently talking to you from Wellington in New Zealand. Due to world events, I'm not where I currently live, and I'm sure there's other people out there who are exactly the same as me, though I am safe and well and quite happy in Wellington, so that's all good. I really love dogs. This is a picture of me with my parents' dog. I can't have a dog because I travel far too much, but she's basically my pet, kind of. I used to be a VoIP engineer, and this is why I'm talking about this. I'm really, really, I really do love VoIP. I deployed hundreds of thousands of phones when I was a VoIP engineer, and I'm still pretty fond. And now I do lots of cloud security stuff. I've always worked in infrastructure and networking, and now I'm focusing on doing cloud security, which is super interesting as well. But that's probably a talk for another day. I am a prolific user of GIFs and memes in my presentations. Hopefully, some of them might be a bit obscure. I found that when I was making this talk, there aren't so many telephony related so many telephony related GIFs and memes. So some of them are a bit obscure. So I'll explain them as we go. Just in case you don't know where Melbourne is, I did leave this slide in. Melbourne's at the bottom of Australia. It's the cold and wet part. But currently I'm in Wellington, which is the bottom of New Zealand's North Island. So let's get on to what I'm actually talking about today. So I'm going to talk about a brief history of phone hacking before VoIP, because of course, traditional telephony has been around a lot longer than VoIP, and that was also hacked. So I just wanted to talk briefly about how that was done in the past. Then we're going to talk, and then I'm going to just give you it might be a recap for some of you, but for others, I'm going to give you just a basic overview, a 101 of the basic tech principles for VoIP systems. And then we'll look at the common attack vectors for VoIP and the kind of ways VoIP gets attacked. So now I'm hoping this is going to run successfully over YouTube Live, fingers crossed.
Goose Island, Oregon, please. The number for Dr. Robert Hume, Hume, on Tall Cedar Road.
Checking under Dr. Robert Hume, Hume, on Tall Cedar Road. I find no listing.
What does that mean? He doesn't have a phone?
I'm sorry, I have no listing.
Oh, wait, Falcon. Dr. Stephen Falcon, Falken, at the same address.
I find no listing for Dr. Stephen Falcon, Falken, on Tall Cedar Road, Goose Island.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully you could all see and hear that okay. I do think it normally runs okay over YouTube streaming. So if you've never seen that movie before, that's from War Games, which was a well-known, beloved hacker movie, even today, from the 1980s. If you haven't seen it, do go watch it, because there are so many in-jokes and references in InfoSec generally that I understood a lot better after I'd seen War Games. But the reason I'm showing you this clip is, of course, what Matthew Broderick was doing there was what a lot of us would consider traditional phone hacking. Now, interestingly, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but if you look up that clip on YouTube and read the comments, you'll see a lot of critique of this. In fact, what Matthew Broderick did on a payphone in the US in the 1980s wouldn't have been possible. It would have been possible maybe in the 60s, but in most phones by the 80s had actually got dial tone as standard when you picked up the phone, and that was so you could call the emergency services without having to put money in. So effectively tripping the to get the dial tone, tripping the phone to get the dial tone like you saw there, you wouldn't have needed to do in the 80s. I won't talk about that more than that, but if you, as I said, if you look up that clip, you can see some in-depth critique in the comments if you were interested. So let's have a look at the history of phone hacking. So the first ever hack was in 1903, so over 100 years ago, and that was it was done of the wireless telegram. It was done by a magician. His name was Neville Maskelyne, and he intercepted Marconi's wireless signal with a very basic antenna, and he was sending funny messages, basically mocking Marconi and mocking the wireless. The reason he did this was because one of Marconi's claims was that the wireless was very secure, it couldn't be intercepted, and all your messages would be private. So Maskelyne decided to prove him wrong. And then 4 days later, a letter confessing to what he'd done, he sent to the Times newspaper, and he said that he justified his actions on the grounds that he was doing a public good by revealing these security holes. Interestingly, it transpired that Neville was actually paid to do this by a telegram company, a wired telegram company, who were rivals of Marconi's, because they just spent a lot of money installing physical telegraph poles. And of course, Marconi's wireless didn't require that. So it was within their interest to discredit his invention as much as possible. So I think the really interesting thing about this, of course, is that this was over 100 years ago, and we still see this behavior today, as in somebody will claim something is unhackable, then of course it basically challenges people to go and hack it. And obviously nowadays nobody would write a letter in a newspaper to confess their hack. Now someone would post online, but it's really interesting to draw so many similarities with what we do today. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Next, I'm going to move on to phone phreaking, which started in the 1950s. Now, you might be thinking, Sarah, you've definitely missed talking about intercepting things in the war and talking about the Enigma machine and how things were decoded. Now, I've purposely left that out of this talk, more because I think that's much better. Well, it's much more well known, and it's come to prevalence. There's been a lot of and there's been movies and books and more things written about it quite recently. So that's why I've kind of skipped it over in this talk. So moving on to phone phreaking, which was a post-war thing. The term phreak comes from a combination of the words phone free and phreak. Phreaking first began when people found that they could various different whistles that were put down a telephone could actually recreate the correct pitch of the phone routing signal. And that meant they could actually trick the phone system into making calls for free. Some phreakers actually built devices that would do it for them, and they could also sometimes eavesdrop on calls. Now, again, I'm big on my GIFs and memes. As you can see, I could only find Barney and a big telephone. There's not so many for phones. You'll see as we continue through this talk. Here's a couple of fun facts about phone phreaking. Some people could whistle in a perfect pitch in order to phone phreak without any equipment. And I'm actually going to show you a clip of that in a second. A gentleman called John Draper discovered that a whistle that was distributed as a freebie in the Captain Crunch cereal, which is cereal you get in the US, emitted a perfect pitch. And here's a picture of it. And so basically this freebie you could use to do phone phreaking. The most common way that people would do phreaking was by the use of something called a blue box. That was actually my first introduction to phone phreaking. It was at a hacker conference a number of years ago that I first got to play around with one. And both Steve Jobs and Woz made blue boxes at college. They're well known for being involved in phone phreaking. Phreaking largely died out in around the 1980s. It does depend a little bit on which country, when out-of-band signaling was introduced. So the difference between in-band signaling and out-of-band signaling is in-band signaling has both the voice signal and the phone routing signal combined together. So by talking through a phone or whistling, it would also be listening for the right tones, which is why if you blew whistles down phones that made the right pitch, you could actually trick the phone system. When the phone signaling went out of band, it didn't matter what tone you pushed down the phone. It was only for the voice signal. So that signaling couldn't be as easily manipulated anymore. So I'll apologize for the quality of this video, but this gentleman is a guy called Joe Ingressia. He was a blind man based in the USA, and he was able to whistle at a perfect pitch.
If you had perfect pitch like blind phone phreak Joe Ingressia, you could whistle calls through the network.
Let's see if I make it this time. This is really hard to do. It sounded like all the tones were present, so the phone should be ringing a bell now. Okay, it hit the phone. It just takes a little while.
He even showed off his skills for the local media.
From his one phone to a town in Illinois and back to...
So there you go. Yeah, Joe could actually do it just by whistling himself, which is pretty cool. Obviously, as I said, it doesn't really work on phone systems anymore, but pretty good party trick. Oh, no, we don't want to watch that again. So moving on to a quick 101 on VoIP technologies. Now, if you've never used VoIP, I'm just going to give you a really basic call flow just to understand how it works. Of course, the main thing between traditional phone systems and VoIP, the main difference is, of course, VoIP is short for voice over IP. So it is all the traffic is carried within an IP network. So when an IP phone wants to call another IP phone on the same system, this is what happens. So IP phones are fairly dumb. They don't do very much themselves. They always have to talk to their call manager. Now, I've called it a call manager, and that is the name of the Cisco product. There are other names out there. Other brands have different names for them. But when someone dials an IP phone, the IP phone will signal to the call manager and say, hey, I have a phone call, I need to go to this number. Where is this number? And the call manager will have a look at the number. It will have a look to see if that number is an internal number or an external number. And then it will send, if it's an internal number, it will return the IP address of the IP phone that the call needs to go to. So the call manager signals back to the IP phone and it says to it, you know, here's your IP address. You need to send the voice traffic to this IP. And then the IP phone will send the voice stream to that IP address that corresponds to the IP phone. And then the traffic goes directly between the two phones. It's important to remember that at no point does the call server that's doing all the controlling of the phones, the voice stream never goes up to the call server. And that's to do with being efficient and removing single points of failure. And there's various different reasons, but that is a major difference. In traditional telephony networks, the call stream would have to go through every single telephone switch in the exchange. So slightly different when we're talking about VoIP phones dialing a phone external to the VoIP network. It may be a phone, it could be any phone. So that gray cloud there is the PSTN. If you're not familiar with that acronym, it stands for the Public Switch Telephone Network. And that's what we call the wider phone network. So whoever runs the phone network in your country, whoever the big telco providers are, they maintain the PSTN in your country. So if someone calls a phone number that is outside the IP network, once again, the IP phone will talk to the call manager and it will say, ask it, I have this number I need to send a call to, where do I send it? If it's an external number, the call manager will tell the IP phone to send it to a gateway. Now, in this diagram, it's marked as router. Essentially, a voice gateway is a router with additional software and maybe additional hardware loaded into it. And that router will be connected to the PSTN. There are lots of different ways to connect to PSTNs. Nowadays, it's probably going to be through SIP and SIP trunking, but there are the more traditional T1, E1, ISDN, there's quite a lot of other ways that we used to do it as well, though you probably wouldn't see those too commonly anymore. So the call manager will, instead of giving the IP address of a phone, if it's a call that needs to go external, will give the IP address will give the IP address of the router or the voice gateway. The IP phone will send its voice traffic to the voice gateway, and then the voice gateway will send it out into the PSTN, who will then route it to the phone. And of course, there is a couple of streams of signaling there that should go in there as well. The router does talk to the call manager as well, because the call manager controls everything. So that's a very, very basic 101 about how VoIP works. If you understand that, you're good. You may have come across some well-known VoIP providers. Of course, there's people like Cisco, Avaya, Broadsoft, Mitel. I'm not going to read them all out, but I'm sure that you've probably come across some of these. And even if you don't have a physical VoIP phone on your desk anymore, there will be VoIP technologies in the collaboration software that you're using, if it's Zoom, if it's Teams, if it's Slack, etc. So, you know, this stuff is very much still around, even if you don't have a physical phone on your desk. So let's get down to the good stuff, and let's look at common VoIP attack vectors. So the first one is VLAN hopping, and this is a classic VoIP network-based attack. It does require someone to have physical access to the network, and essentially, if you're unfamiliar with this, when you configure an access port on a network, you would typically configure two VLANs. You would configure the access VLAN or the data VLAN, and you would configure the voice VLAN. Now, if you plug in your computer or laptop, whatever it is, physically to an access port with both of those VLANs, you would automatically be assigned to the data VLAN. because your switch can tell what's plugged into it. However, it is fairly easy to hop onto the voice VLAN. And if you change your VLAN from the access VLAN to the voice VLAN, you then can have a look at all the VoIP traffic going across the voice VLAN. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, often VoIP traffic is in the clear. So as soon as you're onto the VLAN, you could deploy Wireshark or something, and you would be seeing all the voice traffic. So this effectively allows people to eavesdrop on calls. Again, I was struggling for GIFs. So the kind of mitigations you can do for VLAN hopping is tamper-proof cables, so stop people being plugged in who shouldn't be. You can hard code MAC addresses, again, so only a device that is supposed to be plugged in is allowed to access anything on a port. I personally, I've listed hard coding MAC addresses as a mitigation to this particular attack, which it is, but I will caveat this with, I'm not a big fan of hard coding MAC addresses. It's very difficult to manage, and it has a great overhead with it. So I'm mentioning it for completeness, but you might want to think about the overheads of actually doing that. And then the last one is firewalling off any phones that you have in public areas. So if you have a phone in your lobby or in a reception where you let other people use it, or other people could use it, or they could just unplug the phone and plug in their laptop, that's another place where you might want to put a firewall in between that and the rest of your network, just to have that extra layer of protection. Next is DDoS, or it's also known as TDoS, telephony denial of service. It's pretty much the same principle as DDoS, except it's for telephones, and this can happen in a ton of different ways. A fairly well-known one recently was a very new iOS bug bounty hunter. He was looking for bugs in iOS, because I'm sure a lot of you know that Apple paid big money for bug bounties if you can find anything in iOS. But whilst he was looking for bugs, he accidentally, every time he was trying to run these tests, the phones he was running the test on were actually ringing 911 in the area he was in the US. And he, in the end, he ran the test so many times and the phones kept ringing 911 that he actually caused a complete outage on the 911 service in several of the cities surrounding him. Now, that was a mistake. The guy didn't mean to do it, but obviously when we're talking about taking down the people's ability to call the emergency services, that's still fairly serious. The sad thing about that story is that after that person was apprehended and they were told about what they were doing, the sad thing was, the sad thing was that there were a number of different copycat attacks, and people were on purpose TDOSing the 911 service in the US, which is a really, really strange thing to do. And I can't understand why people would do it, but there are some strange people out there. Again, more generally, attacks against VoIP systems are designed to overload the phone servers or the application servers with too many call signaling messages. So it's kind of exactly the same as you would do. It's the same principle, just using different protocols. In particular, attacking DNS servers can really grind VoIP to a halt, because most VoIP systems do rely on DNS to resolve IP addresses to phone names. And then finally, there is war dialing. So if you haven't seen War Games, do go and watch it. War dialing is using an automated machine to keep dialing numbers time and time and time again. Nowadays, it used to be a physical machine. Nowadays, we'd probably just use a computer with a script, but it is something that that's still present. For DDoS, I couldn't think of anything too useful, so I went for an overflowing thing of beer, because it's too many requests, too much stuff. It's slightly abstract, forgive me. I talked about this, I touched on this slightly earlier, but VoIP protocols, and they're split into two types. They are signaling and the protocols that actually carry the voice stream or the voice traffic. Most of them, by default, are in the clear. So they are completely in clear text. They are very easily interceptable. If you did a packet capture, you would be able to pull the voice stream. Commonly used VoIP protocols are SIP, RTP, H323, MGCP. SCCP is known as Skinny. It's a Cisco proprietary protocol. Many of these do have secure versions, but some of them don't. And that's because some of them don't have a secure version, and what you need to do is encapsulate them in some kind of VPN tunnel, which can be difficult to do. So as you can see here, if anyone's a Game of Thrones fan, it's just fairly shameful. There are these protocols in the clear. I will say, to be fair, that some of these VoIP protocols nowadays are very old, and it didn't used to be, you know, it didn't used to have, you know, we didn't used to have the same focus on making sure there was an encrypted version of every single protocol. So we probably shouldn't be too harsh on at least some of the older ones. But it's of course, that doesn't remove from the fact there is still potentially a risk there. So I think it's important to know. So toll fraud, this is the successor to phreaking. Now, if there's anybody on the call from any of these countries, I do apologize. I'm not trying to have a go at your country, but the top 5 countries to call using toll fraud at the moment are apparently Cuba, Somalia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Estonia, Latvia, and I know that when I was a VoIP engineer, we used to generally block Nigeria as well. There's quite a, and Pakistan, they tended to be quite a lot of toll fraud to those countries as well. So essentially toll fraud is getting calls for free. It usually involves manipulating users or manipulating misconfigurations in the system. So I can give you a real life example from when I was a VoIP engineer. There was in a public area in the company that we built a VoIP platform for, there was a security guard who would call, he used to dial numbers abroad. I can't remember what country he was dialing, but what he would do is he would put a call forward all on the phone in reception, forward it to this foreign number, and he would dial the reception phone with his mobile phone. So he would pay for the call from his mobile phone to the work phone, which was just a local call, and then the phone system would initiate the leg of the call from the reception phone to the foreign country. So in fact, the company was getting billed for his international calls, which is obviously wrong, and he shouldn't have done it, but that's a great example of toll fraud. So, you know, it can be done in phones as well. And that could have been stopped with a really simple configuration change, is that public phones shouldn't be allowed to do a call forward all. And if they were allowed to do call forward all, it should only be to local numbers. So phishing or voice phishing, I'm not going to talk about this too much. I'm sure that everybody who on the phone has probably been called by a scammer at some point in their life, but I did want to mention it here for completeness. Of course, there are a lot of voice-based telephone scams out there. You know, it happens all the time. People pretend to be people from support, from the tax offices. They pretend to be the police, and they manipulate people. I mean, it probably comes a little bit more under social engineering, but I wanted to mention for completeness. Something I learned when I was actually researching for this talk is I didn't realize there are people on YouTube who purposely go and call these support people to waste their time, these fake support people to waste their time, and to and they actually record it, and they just basically spend hours on the phone with them because they know that they're scammers and they want to stop them calling other people. And yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. So if you want to spend a very interesting half an hour on YouTube, or even longer, there's quite a few of those videos. Up here, I put chocolate fish. In New Zealand, where I am at the moment, chocolate covered marshmallow fish. are a like candy that you can get over here. When I worked in New Zealand last time I actually worked here permanently, we, as a part of our phishing campaign, gave out chocolate fish. So if we were all in person, I would probably be giving you chocolate fish, but unfortunately that's not what we can do at the moment. So I apologize. If you ever see one, have one for me. Moving on to contact centers. Now, contact centers, if you've ever called a contact center, which I'm sure you have, you will know that contact centers have the systems where it says press 1 for this, press 2 for this. Now, that system is called an IVR, or an interactive voice response system. And if you think about some of the things you've done with IVR, in fact, they can have some really, really sensitive information. So I know that when I call my bank, sometimes rather than me telling the call center worker my PIN, they will put me on hold, and I will put my PIN into the IVR application, and that will subsequently check that with the back-end systems at the bank without me having to tell the person on the phone. And whilst that is more secure, of course, all of that is going into an application and being handled by an application, and it's obviously talking to other systems in the back end. So if that system isn't sufficiently secured, then there could be risk of a breach there. So if you are using IVRs in your business, if you have a contact center part of your business and you're using IVRs, do make sure to not forget to have a look at how they handle data, because it might be they connect insecurely to a database at the back end. It could be that they don't adequately clear down the resources. They might get cached or something like that. So it's definitely worth checking those things, because that could, of course, lead to data breaches. So SS7 hacking, this is going slightly outside VoIP, but I think it's an important one to mention. SS7 is the signaling that's used in the traditional telephone network, so the PSTN, and this is what is used all over the world. Now, Hacking Team, if you're not aware of this story, Hacking Team were an Italian company who made hacking software and sold it to governments that have had in the past, at least, questionable human rights records. And they were basically selling them hacking tools to be able to spy on people. It did become a fairly big controversy. And one of the tools that Hacking Team developed was something to intercept SS7 signaling. And what that meant was that they could forward calls, they could record them, they could read SMSs, and they could also see the location of people's phones. Now, it's not as straightforward as saying, well, okay, clearly we need to get rid of SS7 and use a different signaling system, because this has been de facto for quite a long time all across the world. Some network carriers have installed monitoring systems to mitigate the risk, but the fact is that SS7 is still used everywhere. And this is why we say you shouldn't use SMS as part of MFA. You should use something different. So you could use an authenticator app or any kind of biometrics. There's lots of alternatives nowadays for doing MFA that doesn't have to include SMS. Now, I'm not saying if SMS is your only choice for MFA, then it's certainly better than nothing. But I know that NIST and a lot of organizations and security companies now are really advising a move away from SMS if possible. And because, of course, what we want to do is we want to keep out the hackers. This is one of my favorite hacker gifs. I put it in most of my talks, to be honest with you. And then voicemail attacks. So voicemail is fairly insecure by default. And if someone is planning an attack on a VoIP system, I would definitely look at the voicemail to start with. Voicemails often have default pins that are not changed. Here's Clippy for no reason at all. I needed something to fill the page. If we were in person, I would give you Clippy stickers, but sadly we are not. And you may remember a number of years ago well, quite a number of years ago now in the UK, a lot of celebrities had their voicemails hacked. And I say hacked in inverted commas, because what happened was essentially journalists got well-known people's numbers. So that was celebrities and other high-profile people in the UK. They got their telephone numbers, dialed the provider's voicemail number, put in their telephone number, and then would try the default PIN, or they would guess the PIN. And a lot of the time, because people at that time were not prompted to change default PINs, the journalists got in and they got to listen to people's voicemails. And of course, then that was a breach of privacy, and they found out things that they could report in the paper. The saddest thing about this particular incident was that there was a schoolgirl in the UK who was murdered. But before they knew she'd been murdered, when people were still looking for her, journalists managed to get into her voicemail and they listened to her voicemails. Now, I'm sure you know that if you listen to a voicemail, in your voicemail system, the voicemail system, if you dial in again, will no longer tell you that that voicemail is new. It will say you have a saved voicemail. Now, that's what happened when these journalists listened to this young girl's voicemails. And it really sadly, because the voicemails had been listened to, the police and her family thought that she had listened to them and that there was a chance she was still alive, which I think is by far and away the saddest thing that happened during this whole scandal. So yeah, and it did, it quite rightly, people went to jail for this eventually. They were prosecuted, and I think quite rightly so. Very, very sad story. So why is VoIP still important? I'm going to put everything up on the screen here so you can have a read. But as I said, VoIP technology still exists behind the scenes. You may not have a phone on your desk anymore, but VoIP technology is in your collaboration software. So you should have a look, whatever you're using at work or whatever you use with your families, have a look and see what's there. And this might be something you want to incorporate into your next risk assessment, or maybe your pen testing, or attack modeling or threat modeling. More relevant for probably everyone is you're probably using SMS for MFA in some parts of your life. I know that some banks still use it. I still get a one-time passcode from my bank via SMS. And understanding generally how things work, or even how things used to work, is really great to think laterally for doing future hacking, even if it's specifically not VoIP. Understanding how things work and fit together is always super useful, and that's why I think it's important to just learn widely and broadly as you can. So this is the take a photo or take a screenshot for link slide. There's a couple of articles there. Some of these I used to create this talk. I'd really recommend, if you have a spare half an hour, listening to How Phone Phreaking Worked by a gentleman called the 8-Bit Guy. He did quite an in-depth talk about that. But there's loads of material online about these things. So I'd really recommend, if it's something that interests you, if it sparks your interest, there's a lot of material, and go and learn something more about it. And thank you very much, InfoSec Girls, for having me. That's the end of my talk. I really hope you enjoyed it, and thank you ever so much for attending and listening and your attention. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah.
No problem.
It was really an amazing session.
Oh, thank you for having me, Vandana. It's always lovely to talk to you and talk and, you know, present something to people who are interested.
Great, thank you so much. So I just checked, there was one question, will this be here for later reference, which means they wanted to hear your talk again. There are a few people who couldn't join early, so but it will be there. So it'll be on the YouTube.
Yeah, is it being recorded? Will it get posted afterwards? I don't know how the YouTube live works. Oh, yes. There you go then. That's all good.
Yes, it'll be there.
Cool.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We will be live again in the evening at 7 o'clock IST, and which is Indian Standard Time, and 9:30 EST. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more sessions coming up.